we used to have like this. I'm just drawing roughly, you can see, you know. And okay, so this is the book. We would remove this letter. See, it's a beautiful book.